Mandatory vaccinations, vaccination certificates, closed borders, mandatory lockdowns, quarantines, masks, fear-based reporting, state of emergency procedures, rockstar premiers, trading the illusion of safety for freedom, and no real-world advice or talks about heart disease, lung cancer, or alcohol-related deaths or diseases. That is where we're at right now. That's what we're gonna talk about a bit today, man. And I'm sorry that it's heavy, but it's on my mind. That's what I'm talking about with people. That's what I hear people talking about. It's a massive issue with work right now. People are going to lose their jobs. People are losing their jobs. It's already happening. People are being forced to make hard decisions that really goes against their morals because of fear and because of being bullied into it. They are being bullied into it by the government, by a certain industry. And then look, I'm no activist by any stretch of the imagination, but this is just something that you have to talk about. It's being talked about and it's happening right now. And like I said, trading our freedom for the illusion of safety, because this disease, for starters, isn't what it was thought to be when it first came out. The numbers do not stack up. The numbers are out and they don't stack up. You're talking about a 0.3 to 0.5% mortality rate after infection. That's it. And they're all, nearly all, I think 95% with like 4 comorbidities plus. Okay, so yeah, there's vulnerable people that need to be protected from this thing for sure. But they're getting crazy now, talking about who's got to have the vaccination. Kids, for starters, forcing pregnant women who are working to have it. There's no data on what on the effects on pregnant people, and they're going to force them to have it to keep their jobs. And like anybody that listens to this podcast knows that, look, I'm double vaccinated. So is my wife. She's an immuniser. She gives these vaccinations out and knows a fair bit about what's going on. So I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm pro-rights, and that's what I am. I'm pro-human rights, especially in this country. And it's just scary to me to see us trading away our liberties, out of fear-based decisions. So look, it's going to be a little bit heavy. I apologise in advance for that, but we got to talk about it. Hey, I brought you in with Sleep Now in the Fire by Rage Against the Machine for this episode number 106. And that's a good protest song. I was looking for a good protest song, something that wasn't too on the nose. I actually tried to get. I actually thought about playing "Freedom Isn't Free" from the Team America soundtrack. I thought it was funnier in my head, and when I played it, it was very subtle and takes ages to get to the punchlines, so it wouldn't have worked for an intro song. But that's exactly right. We are giving up. We're trading our freedoms right now, and I believe that a lot of it is because of misinformation. So I suppose we should rewind a little bit and just see where we are right now. So it's Sunday the 24th, I think 24th of October. On Thursday, Arvo, Mark McGowan put out a statement saying that 75% of West Australian workers are going to need to be vaccinated, double vaccinated. The finish, there's a couple of deadlines, but the end deadline is by the end of January 2022 to be able to work in their industry in WA, and other states are doing very similar things at the moment as well. This comes after the mining sector had already put out its deadline of January the 1st to be double vaccinated, which affects, I'm not in mining, but we contract for a mining company, obviously the big one, BHP. So that affects us directly. And again, I'm already vaccinated. I didn't know that the people's jobs were going to be at stake, but I already knew your freedoms were going to be on the line for this vaccination as far as travel, you know, and where you can go interstate and wearing masks and all that kind of crap. So I went ahead and got it. I wasn't really worried about the vaccine itself anyway. Just sort of been more pissed off about the way the whole thing's been handled, and it seems like a lot of governments are handling it the same. Not a lot of information, not a lot of like real information, trying to hold shit back from people. And in today's day and age, I just don't think that's a wise move, because the information gets out anyway. They're trying to call it misinformation, and then all the conspiracy theories pop up, and I just don't think that was the way to go. People want to know the truth, and they want you to tell them the pros and cons about things so they can weigh it up for themselves, because it's been pretty clear that the truth is not being told. Australia, we're more conservative and sort of very like, you know, a bit of a whack with the stick, and we seem to get in line. But over in the US and parts of Europe, they're really been fighting this thing a lot harder, and there's bigger numbers of people and more data and stuff coming in as well. But it's been clear that the social media companies, generally very left-wing in their political views, have been silencing people for going against the narrative. People who actually quite often know what they're talking about, giving statistics about the vaccines and about other options outside of the vaccine. Those people have been kicked off, you know, Twitter and some of the other bigger, and YouTube and some of the really big social media platforms for spreading disinformation. That's a whole other conversation about the freedom of speech, and how social media companies have basically found a loophole where they can work outside of that idea of freedom of speech. But people have been silenced for giving out real world numbers and figures. So that's an issue. And the people giving the vaccinations, you know, the medical professionals in this country really only get fed one line of information as well, and it's just dodgy, basically. You know, there's a lot of information out there right now saying that the vaccines, I think there's a different efficacy rate for all of them, but generally the general consensus is like between 3 to 5 or 6 months they really start dropping off the efficacy of them, and by like 8 months you're kind of at the end of the efficacy period. You get a booster as well, so now they're talking about this third booster, which there's no information on, there's no data. The vaccines weren't developed to have multiple shots within a 12-month period, and that's what they're going to start doing now, especially for frontline like health workers and school teachers and all those kind of people in the front line, and that's, for one, is kind of dodgy. And again, in Australia, we seem to be behind the whole curve, but we're also, our laws are way stricter than in anywhere else in the world as far as our lockdowns. They're all talking about Australia and calling us a prison state, and talking about how we're still in lockdowns. Melbourne, the most lockdown city in the world. These mandatory quarantines, still this mandatory quarantine procedures. One sniff of a case in a city and they're locking down the entire cities, especially old Mark McGowan. It's just kind of crazy now. We're like 20 months into this thing and we're still behaving like this fear-based system that the rest of the world adopted at the very first, the first few months of this whole thing. And the Australian people were just taking it, just eating it. It's probably taken me a long time to really get pissed off about the whole thing, because living up in Port Hedland, it hasn't really affected us. It's just, you've just watched it play out in the background, and I'm probably guilty of really only being interested in what's happening directly in my own sphere a lot of the times. I get busy enough with what I have in front of me. So, but I guess the fact that now the mandatory vaccines, we're losing guys at work, and I think that's happening through all industries across the board. Seeing people make big decisions based on poor information and having dire consequences for those decisions has been, it's stressing me out a little bit, to be honest. And not like I am not obviously I don't know fuck all about anything. That's the whole point of this podcast. I'm just a bloke that talks about shit he thinks and feels. But there's some pretty good information out now outside the general narrative that you're getting, and from both sides as well of the coin. There was 2 podcasts in particular I recently listened to. On Joe Rogan's podcast, he had on Alex Berenson, who was like a journalist from the New York Times once upon a time, and he's been kicked off Twitter for spreading statistics about the vaccines that were against the common narrative, the popular narrative, and he really just goes into all those numbers about infection rates among the vaccinated, which are still high, and how they can still transmit, and the hospital rates and death rates of people among the vaccinated, which are again quite high. And it's not black and white, it's quite nuanced, because you can say things like 97, or I think it's 7 out of 10 people in Israel that die from COVID are fully vaccinated, but they're also in the older category, and there also is like 90% vaccination rate over there or something. So it makes, there is nuance in that conversation. It's not just black and white. There's going to be more people vaccinated who are dying when most of the people are vaccinated, and they're all in the older age group are definitely vaccinated. So that kind of makes sense. But there is some other statistics coming out of the UK and Israel and shit where you can look at the numbers and go, okay, it's not what they told us it was, and they know that. That's why they're now talking about 3rd shots. And then you look at the FDA, who not approved it at first, and then they did approve it, and big wigs from the FDA in America left the board like 2 weeks after that decision, and all this sort of dodgy, shady shit that's going on. And again, people getting silenced for giving out information. Like, you should understand the things like the fact that it maybe isn't as effective as was first thought to be, but also the disease isn't as bad as first thought to be. And there's another big problem where we again haven't really experienced this in Australia with such low cases, but around the world. But I think eventually the idea is, and Mark McGowan even sort of alluded to this fact, that the COVID's here to stay. We're not going to stop it from spreading, so we want to get everybody vaccinated and open up and basically get used to the idea that it's going to go through, it's going to be community transfer everywhere through WA and everything. So eventually, basically, we're all going to be exposed to it at one point or another, like the flu. So there's things that we can put in place in the meantime before we just get over it, like antigen tests and shit, which would mean that you obviously have antibody tests, which would tell you if you've had the virus, and then you have your own antibodies now, which gives you, like, if you listen to Rogan's podcast, I'm sure you've heard all these figures thrown out a bunch, but if you don't, it's something like 13 times the protection you get from the antibodies developed after actually having COVID than you get from the vaccine itself. So if you've had it already, you're way more protected than somebody that's just had the vaccine and hasn't had the virus. But in places like Europe and America, where there's been heaps of community transfer spread, they're not allowing people to just produce antibody tests. They're saying you still have to be vaccinated, which doesn't make sense. Obviously, when you think about that, you've had the virus, you're more protected than a vaccinated person who hasn't had it, but you still have to have it to do X, Y, and Z. That's not logical, not fair, and it's not scientific. So that's bullshit. And that'll be the case here eventually. We'll all be exposed to it, and people can show that they've had the virus and have higher antibodies. And the other thing you can do is an antigen test, which is, I'm just regurgitating things I've heard here. I obviously don't know this personally, but apparently what this is an antigen test can tell you when you're basically when you're contagious. So if you were to do an antigen test, it would say, you'd get a reading. It would tell you that you're contagious at the moment if you had the virus. So you don't go out. You don't go out because you're contagious for 2 or 3 days, whatever it is, until you get clear numbers on that antigen test, and then you can go out. And if you're not sick and you can go out and you're not going to spread it to anyone. That makes a lot of sense as well. So yeah, the vaccine has got a place, especially for all the older people. Like, they should definitely be having it. They should probably have the 3rd one too, by all accounts at the moment, because of the high risk group and all that, other people who are in high risk areas. But like, not every single person should be having it, but that's what's gonna happen. So where I sit with that, right, is this this is in my opinion, right? This is my opinion. This is the wrong fight. Here in Australia, this is the wrong fight to have. This not getting vaccinated fight. It's bullshit. I've just gone on for 5 minutes about why it's bullshit.